He thought the road belonged to him, until the night it answered back. The hum of tires against asphalt stretched endlessly across Highway 287, a lonely ribbon cutting through the dark Texas plains where the sky felt wider and the silence heavier. The kind of silence that made people grip their steering wheels just a little tighter as mile markers passed like quiet witnesses. Under the pale wash of distant headlights, Officer Ryan Cole leaned casually against his patrol car, the red and blue lights behind him casting slow, rhythmic pulses across the empty road, painting the scene in authority and warning, a language every driver understood without needing a single word. He checked his watch, then the rearview mirror, then the road again, patient in the way only someone accustomed to control could be, because for Ryan, this stretch of highway wasn't just part of his jurisdiction, it was his territory, his system, his quiet routine built over years no one had questioned. Not really. Cars came and went, most allowed to pass without a second glance, but every so often, one would catch his eye, not for what it did, but for what he believed it represented. And tonight, that moment arrived with the low purr of a black sedan approaching at exactly 65 miles per hour, steady, composed, almost too composed, like it didn't belong out here in the dark. Ryan straightened, the faintest smirk forming as he stepped into position, flicking on his lights with practiced ease. The sudden burst of color breaking the night like a command no one ignored. The sedan slowed immediately, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder without hesitation, its brake lights glowing softly as dust settled around it. Ryan took his time walking up, boots crunching against the ground, one hand resting near his belt, the other tapping lightly against the door as if keeping rhythm with a song only he could hear. Inside, Naomi Brooks sat still, both hands visible on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed but precise, her eyes forward, watching the reflection of flashing lights dance across her windshield without a flicker of panic, without the slightest sign of confusion, just quiet awareness. Ryan leaned down slightly, his voice cutting through the stillness, smooth but edged with something colder beneath it. "Evening, ma'am. You know why I pulled you over tonight?" The question hung there, heavy, familiar, designed not for answers, but for control, and for a moment, there was only the faint sound of wind brushing across the open plains before Naomi turned her head just enough to meet his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't come from ignorance but from certainty. "No, officer," she replied evenly, her tone steady, measured, almost too steady for someone alone on a dark Texas highway being stopped by a stranger with a badge, and something about that, something subtle, almost invisible, made Ryan pause for half a second longer than usual, though he quickly masked it with a small chuckle, stepping back slightly as he gestured toward the road behind them. "Well, I've been watching traffic out here for a while," he said, his voice tightening just enough to reclaim the moment. "And your vehicle caught my attention." A vague explanation, intentionally so, leaving room for interpretation, leaving room for pressure. Naomi nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a formality, rather than an accusation, her hands never leaving the wheel, her breathing even, her silence deliberate. The air between them shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone passing by to notice, but enough that the night itself seemed to lean in closer, as if something unseen had just entered the conversation. Ryan's eyes flicked briefly across the interior of the car, taking in the details, the neatness, the absence of anything out of place, and then back to her face, searching, measuring, calculating the way he always did, because this moment, this interaction, was one he had repeated dozens of times, maybe hundreds, always ending the same way, always bending in his favor. But Naomi didn't look like the others, didn't react like the others, and as the silence stretched just a second too long, she spoke again, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "Officer, are you sure you want to do this?" The words weren't loud, weren't confrontational, but they landed with a weight that didn't match their softness. And for the first time that night, Ryan Cole felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his certainty. Not fear, not yet, but something closer to hesitation, something that didn't belong on this road he thought he owned, something that didn't fit the pattern he had relied on for years. And as the distant sound of another car echoed faintly in the distance, the flashing, Lights continued to pulse, steady and unchanging, unaware that this stop, like so many before it, had already begun to move in a direction he could no longer control. Ryan did not answer her question right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have said out loud, because for a man like him, hesitation was not part of the script. It lingered for just a second too long before he exhaled slowly and straightened his posture, letting authority settle back over his shoulders like a uniform he had worn for years. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone firmer now, sharper, as if reasserting control would erase whatever had just unsettled him. Naomi did not move immediately, not out of defiance, but with the deliberate pace of someone who understood timing, her fingers releasing the steering wheel one at a time before she opened the door and stepped onto the gravel, the cool Texas air brushing against her face as the distant hum of the highway continued behind them. She stood beside her car, composed, her hands visible, her expression unchanged, and Ryan watched her closely, searching again for something: nervousness, irritation, anything that would confirm the pattern he expected. But there was nothing, just that same quiet steadiness that made the moment feel off balance in a way he could not quite explain. "License and registration," he continued, extending his hand, and she reached back into the car, retrieving her documents with calm precision before placing them in his palm, her fingers steady, her eyes never leaving his. Ryan glanced down at the license, his gaze scanning the name, Naomi Brooks, the address, the details, all ordinary on the surface. And yet something about the way she stood there made the information feel incomplete, like he was only seeing part of the picture. "You traveling alone tonight, Ms. Brooks?" he asked, his voice casual on the surface but edged with scrutiny, and she nodded once. "Yes, officer." Her answer simple, direct, offering nothing extra, giving him no leverage to expand, no opening to push further. And that, more than anything, tightened something in his chest. He circled the vehicle slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the exterior, the beam catching reflections in the polished paint, the tires, the windows, everything in perfect order, too perfect, he thought, as if perfection itself had become suspicious. "Mind if I take a look inside?" "Your vehicle?" he asked, stopping near the driver's side again, the question framed as optional but delivered like an expectation, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, just enough to signal awareness. "Do you have a reason to search my car, officer?" she replied, her voice still even, still controlled, but now carrying a quiet firmness that shifted the tone of the exchange. Ryan smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. "I am asking for your cooperation," he said, choosing his words carefully, and for a moment, the wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass along the roadside, filling the space between them with a low whisper that seemed to stretch the tension thinner and thinner. Naomi glanced briefly toward the horizon, where distant headlights flickered like fading stars, then back to him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I always cooperate with lawful requests," she said, emphasizing the last two words just enough to be noticed, and there it was again, that subtle shift, that quiet resistance wrapped in calm language, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. Ryan's grip tightened slightly around her license as he studied her face, trying to read what was behind that composure, trying to place why this stop felt different from all the others, why the familiar rhythm of control was slipping just slightly out of reach. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of a truck horn rolled across the open land, and the flashing lights behind him continued their steady pulse, marking time, marking authority, marking a moment that was no longer as simple as it had been just minutes ago. Naomi's phone rested inside her car, screen dark, silent, but unseen to Ryan. A small icon blinked once, then again, as something had already been sent, something already in motion, and as he finally handed her license back, his voice lower now, more measured, he said, "You know, Ms. Brooks, people out here sometimes forget how things work," and she met his gaze without hesitation, her reply quiet but precise. "No, officer. I think some people just assume they do." And in that instant, the air seemed to shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the first drop before a storm, and though Ryan did not realize it yet, the road he had controlled for years had already begun to turn against him. Ryan let out a slow breath, the kind that usually came with certainty, but this time it carried something heavier, something unsettled, and he turned slightly away from Naomi, as if creating distance could restore the control he felt slipping through his fingers. The flashing lights behind him continued their steady rhythm, casting alternating shadows across the side of her car, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretching across the open highway like a held breath that refused to release. He stepped toward his patrol vehicle, glancing back once, expecting to see the usual signs by now. Restlessness, anxiety, maybe even fear, but Naomi remained exactly where she was, composed, unmoving, her posture straight, her gaze following him not with concern, but with quiet awareness, as if she already knew how this moment would unfold. Inside his car, Ryan reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the controls before pressing down, his voice low and controlled as he called in the stop, listing the location, the plate number, the driver's name, each word measured, each detail routine, and yet something in his tone lacked the confidence it once carried. Static crackled back at him, a dispatcher's voice acknowledging the call, normal, procedural, but as the transmission ended, Ryan lingered there for a second longer, staring through the windshield at Naomi's silhouette framed in the alternating light. Trying to reconcile the calm he saw with the situation he believed he controlled, he stepped out. Again, closing the door with a firm click, his expression reset, his posture rigid, determined to push forward, because hesitation was not an option, not here, not now. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said as he approached her, his tone deliberate, each word placed carefully. "Do you consent to a search of your vehicle?" The question hung in the air, heavier this time, less like a request, and more like a line drawn across the gravel beneath their feet. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that pause, that deliberate stillness, seemed to stretch the moment into something sharper, something more defined, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, unmistakably clear. "No, officer, I do not consent." There was no hesitation, no apology, no attempt to soften the refusal, just a simple statement. Grounded in certainty, Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, the faintest flicker of irritation crossing his face before it disappeared beneath a practiced calm. Because this was not how it usually went, not out here, not under these lights. And yet here he was, standing in front of someone who refused to follow the script he had relied on for years. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal, more direct. "You understand that refusing cooperation can make things more complicated," he said, his words carrying an implied weight, an unspoken pressure designed to tip the balance back in his favor. Naomi met his gaze. Without flinching, her expression unchanged, her voice just as steady as before. "I understand my rights," she replied, and there it was again, that quiet shift, that subtle but undeniable resistance that did not rise in volume, did not escalate in tone, but stood firm all the same. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the roadside grass, carrying with it the distant hum of approaching vehicles that had not yet reached them, and for the first time that night, Ryan felt the space around him expand in a way that did not feel controlled, did not feel contained, as if the road itself was no longer entirely his. He glanced toward her car again, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching for anything that might justify the next step, anything that would restore the familiar rhythm of authority, but everything remained as it was, still, composed, untouched by the tension that now lingered between them. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but with the subtle ease of someone who had already settled into the moment, her eyes steady, her breathing even, and as Ryan opened his mouth to speak again, the faint sound of tires approached from behind, growing louder, closer, until a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, then another, and another, their beams cutting through the darkness like quiet signals moving towards something already set in motion. Ryan turned his head briefly, his attention drawn to the approaching lights, his mind calculating, adjusting. And when he looked back at Naomi, something had changed, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the space between them, in the weight of the moment itself, because whatever control he thought he held was no longer absolute, no longer certain, and though he did not yet understand why, the road beneath his feet had already begun to answer in a way he had never expected. The headlights grew brighter, multiplying against the dark horizon until the once empty stretch of highway no longer felt isolated, no longer belonged to a single patrol car and a single officer. And Ryan felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle shift in control that could not be measured but could be sensed, like pressure building in the air before a storm. He straightened instinctively, his hand resting near his belt again, his eyes narrowing as the first SUV slowed behind his cruiser, followed by another vehicle pulling onto the shoulder with deliberate precision, their engines idling low, steady, controlled. This was not random traffic, not curious drivers slowing down. This was intentional, coordinated. And as the doors opened one by one, figures stepped out dressed not in uniforms like his, but in darker, quieter authority, their movements calm, purposeful, without urgency, but without hesitation. Ryan's mind moved quickly, trying to place what he was seeing, trying to match it with a scenario he recognized, but nothing fit, nothing aligned with the script he had relied on for years. And when he turned back toward Naomi, something in her posture confirmed what his instincts had already begun to whisper. She had not moved, had not reacted to the arrival behind them, as if she had been expecting it all along. The air tightened around them, the flashing lights from his patrol car now mixing with the steady beams of the arriving vehicles, casting layered shadows across the gravel shoulder. And for the first time, Ryan felt the weight of being observed, not by passers-by, not by unseen witnesses, but by something structured, something official, something that did not answer to him. One of the approaching figures stepped forward, a man in his late 50s with a composed expression and a presence that did not need to raise its voice to command attention. His suit dark, his badge visible but understated, and when he spoke, his tone was calm, measured, carrying authority without force. "Officer Cole," he said, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes steady. "We need you to step back from the vehicle." The words were not a request, not phrased as one, but delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who expected to be followed. Ryan blinked once, the name hitting him before the instruction did, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single detail. How did he know his name? How did any of this connect? And yet his training pushed him forward, grounding him in procedure. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with something sharper now, something defensive. The man did not react to the tone, did not mirror it. He simply reached into his jacket and presented identification, holding it steady in the glow of the patrol lights. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said quietly, and though the words themselves were simple, the weight behind them landed heavily in the space between them. Ryan's eyes dropped to the badge, then lifted again, his thoughts racing now, trying to catch up, trying to understand how a routine stop had escalated into something far beyond his control, and behind him, more agents positioned themselves calmly, not surrounding, not threatening, but present, unmistakably present. Naomi finally shifted then, just slightly, stepping forward one pace, her voice cutting through the tension with the same calm it had carried from the beginning. "Officer, I believe we are done here," she said, and there was no arrogance in her tone, no triumph, just a quiet finality that closed the space of the encounter like a door gently but firmly shut. Ryan looked at her, really looked this time, seeing not just a driver on the side of the road, not just a name on a license, but something else entirely, something he had missed from the start. And the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, each detail falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. The man beside him spoke again, his voice even. "You are going to need to come with us." And though the night had not grown louder, though the wind still moved the same way across the open Texas land, everything had changed. The road, the lights, the rolls, all of it shifting in a direction Ryan Cole had never prepared for, because for the first time in years, he was no longer the one deciding how this stop would end. Ryan did not move right away, and that hesitation, that brief fracture in his usual certainty, lingered in the air long enough for everyone present to feel it, because for years he had been the one giving instructions on this road, the one shaping outcomes with a voice that rarely met resistance. But now the balance had shifted, quietly, completely, and there was nothing in his experience that prepared him for standing on the other side of that shift. His eyes moved from the federal badge back to the man holding it, searching for doubt, for some indication that this was a misunderstanding. But there was none, only calm, only certainty, only the kind of authority that did not need to raise its volume to be understood. "This does not make any sense," Ryan said finally, his voice lower now, more measured, as if choosing his words carefully could restore control. "I was conducting a lawful stop." And even as he spoke, the statement felt thinner than it ever had before, like something repeated too many times without being questioned. The man nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "We are aware of what you were doing," he replied, his tone steady. "We have been aware for some time." And those words settled heavily, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting patiently to surface. Behind him, one of the agents stepped forward holding a small device, its screen glowing faintly in the dark, and though Ryan could not see the details, he understood enough to feel the weight of it. Documentation, records, something collected, something built over time. Naomi remained where she was, her presence unchanged, but now there was a quiet clarity to the moment, as if everything that had been hidden beneath the surface was beginning to align into focus. For years, the agent continued, his voice calm. Drivers reported being stopped along this stretch of highway. Inconsistent reasons, undocumented searches, cash missing with no record filed. He paused briefly, allowing the words to settle, not as an accusation shouted, but as a record stated. "Patterns take time to confirm, Officer Cole, but they always reveal themselves eventually." And Ryan felt something tighten in his chest, not from the words themselves, but from the realization that this was not a single moment, not a misunderstanding, but something larger, something that had been building quietly without his awareness. "That is not accurate," Ryan replied, though his voice lacked the firmness it once carried. "People make claims all the time." And the agent nodded again, this time with a slight shift in expression. Not dismissive, but knowing. "Yes," he said, "they do. And most of the time, those claims do not go anywhere. But sometimes, someone asks the right questions, sometimes someone decides to listen, and sometimes." His gaze shifted briefly toward Naomi before returning to Ryan. "The wrong person gets stopped." And there it was, the line that connected everything. The moment that had seemed ordinary now revealed as the turning point of something far beyond a roadside encounter. Naomi took a slow step forward, her voice entering the conversation again, calm as ever, but now carrying a quiet authority that no longer needed to remain hidden. "I have been reviewing reports connected to this area for over 6 months, she said, her words precise, measured. "Traffic stops, missing documentation, inconsistencies in procedure." She paused, her eyes meeting Ryan's directly. Tonight was not random, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else spoken so far. Ryan looked at her, really looked this time, seeing not just the calm demeanor, not just the steady voice, but the intention behind it, the preparation, the patience, the certainty that had been present from the very beginning. And in that moment, the question she had asked earlier echoed back in his mind, clear, undeniable. "Are you sure you want to do this?" And now, standing under the flashing lights that no longer felt like his, he understood that the question had never been about the stop itself. It had been about everything that followed. The wind moved again across the open Texas land, carrying with it the distant sound of passing traffic that continued on without stopping, without knowing, without witnessing the quiet collapse of a system that had operated unnoticed for years. And as the agent beside him spoke once more, his tone unchanged. "Officer Cole, you are going to need to come with us so we can continue this conversation." Ryan did not respond immediately, because for the first time, the road was no longer something he controlled. It was something that had led him here, to this moment, to this realization, to the understanding that control, once taken for granted, could disappear without warning, without noise, without resistance, replaced only by the steady, unavoidable presence of truth. Ryan finally moved, but not with the confidence he once carried, not with the certainty that had defined every step he had taken on this stretch of highway for years. Instead, there was a subtle heaviness in his motion, a recognition settling into his posture that this moment was no longer his to shape. He glanced once more at Naomi, as if searching for something that might explain how a routine stop had unraveled into something so precise, so controlled. And yet her expression remained unchanged, calm, grounded, as though she had never been part of the uncertainty at all. Only the outcome. The agent stepped slightly aside, giving Ryan space, not out of deference, but as a gesture of completion, the kind that signaled the next phase had already begun, and Ryan walked toward the SUV with measured steps, each one quieter than the last, the gravel beneath his boots sounding different now, less like authority and more like transition. Behind him, the flashing lights of his patrol car continued their steady rhythm, but they no longer defined the scene. They no longer commanded it. They simply existed, a fading echo of a role that had already been reassigned. The door of the SUV opened, and Ryan paused briefly before stepping inside, his mind moving through fragments of memory, past stops, past conversations, moments he had never questioned, patterns he had never needed to justify, and now each one returned with a different weight, a different perspective, as if seen from the outside for the first time. Inside the vehicle, the air was still, controlled, the faint hum of electronics filling the silence as the door closed behind him with a soft but final sound, and across from him sat another agent, tablet in hand, its screen illuminated with lines of data, timestamps, locations, records that told a story without raising their voice. "This is not about one stop," the agent said calmly, his tone steady, his gaze focused. "This is about a pattern." And he turned the tablet slightly, not to confront, not to accuse, but to present, to show, and Ryan's eyes moved across the screen, seeing familiar locations, dates that stretched back months, then years, small details that had once felt isolated now connected into something structured, something undeniable. Each report alone did not raise concern, the agent continued. But together, they formed consistency. He tapped lightly on the screen, highlighting a sequence of stops along the same highway, the same times, the same outcomes. Consistency becomes evidence. And the words settled into the space between them with quiet certainty. Ryan leaned back slightly, his hands resting still, his thoughts no longer racing but slowing, shifting, recalibrating as the reality in front of him replaced the assumptions he had carried for so long. Outside, the night continued as it always had, the wind moving across the open land, distant vehicles passing by without stopping, unaware of the shift that had taken place just feet away, unaware that the balance of power on this road had quietly reversed. Naomi remained by her vehicle, watching the scene not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a composed awareness that this moment was never about a single encounter. It was about resolution, about bringing something hidden into the light without noise, without spectacle. The agent inside the SUV continued, his voice steady. "You were not the only one involved in these patterns, but you were the most consistent." And Ryan's gaze lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because even without knowing the full scope, he understood what that meant. Understood that this was larger than him, larger than a single role, larger than a single night. The door opened again, and the original agent who had spoken on the roadside leaned slightly into the vehicle, his tone unchanged. "We are going to proceed step by step," he said. "Everything will be documented." And there was no urgency in his voice, no raised volume. Only process, only structure, only the steady unfolding of something that had been set in motion long before this night began. Ryan nodded once, slowly, not as agreement, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. Because for the first time in years, he was no longer operating within a system he controlled. He was now within one that observed, one that recorded, one that responded. Outside, Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving down the empty stretch of highway where headlights continued to pass in the distance. And for a brief moment, the scene returned to stillness, the kind of stillness that follows resolution rather than anticipation, the kind that does not demand attention but leaves an imprint all the same. And as Ryan sat there, surrounded not by noise but by clarity, one thought settled quietly into place, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The road had never truly belonged to him. It had only been waiting for the moment when someone would remind him who it actually served. The door of the SUV remained closed. sealing Ryan inside a space that felt smaller with every passing second, not because of its size, but because of the clarity pressing in from all sides, the kind that left no room for interpretation, no space to reshape the narrative the way he once could. Across from him, the tablet screen shifted again as the agent scrolled, revealing more entries, more timestamps, more quiet pieces of a pattern that had taken years to build and only moments to expose. Each line precise, unemotional, undeniable. There is something people misunderstand about patterns, the agent said calmly, his voice steady as ever. They think patterns are about repetition, but they are really about intention. He paused briefly, letting the distinction settle. Repetition can be coincidence, but intention leaves a trail. And Ryan's gaze remained fixed on the screen, his mind moving through memories that no longer felt distant, no longer disconnected, each one now carrying a different weight, a different meaning. Outside, the steady pulse of lights continued, but now there were additional vehicles positioned along the shoulder, their presence quiet, controlled, forming a scene that was no longer about a single stop, but about something that had been unfolding long before tonight. Naomi stood near the front of her car, her posture unchanged, her arms relaxed at her sides. And yet there was a subtle shift in the way she observed the scene, not as someone waiting for an outcome, but as someone who had already seen it arrive. The same agent who had first approached Ryan now walked toward her, his steps measured, his expression composed, and when he reached her, he spoke in a tone that carried respect without formality. "Everything is in place," he said quietly, and Naomi nodded once. Her response minimal. "Understood," she replied, her voice just as steady as before, as if this moment required no celebration, no reaction beyond acknowledgement. The agent glanced briefly toward the SUV, then back at her. "Your timing was precise," he added, and for a brief moment, the faintest hint of something passed across Naomi's expression, not satisfaction, not relief, but recognition, the kind that comes from seeing a process completed exactly as intended. "It had to be," she said simply, her gaze shifting toward the road, where distant headlights continued to move past, unaware of what had just taken place. Inside the SUV, Ryan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as if grounding himself in something tangible, something real, because the reality in front of him no longer matched the version of events he had lived with for years. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it once carried. Not confrontational, not defensive, just a question, and the agent across from him met his gaze without hesitation. "Now, we document everything," he said. "Every stop, every report, every detail that connects the pattern." His tone remained even, procedural. "This is not about a single moment. It is about the full picture." And Ryan nodded slightly, not because he agreed, but because he understood, because for the first time, he was seeing the full picture from the outside looking in. Outside, Naomi took a slow breath, the night air cool against her skin, and for a moment, the world felt still again, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if something that had been out of balance for a long time had quietly corrected itself without needing noise or force. The agent beside her spoke again. "You knew he would stop you." And Naomi's gaze remained on the road as she answered. "Not for sure," she said, "but I knew he would not pass the opportunity." Her words calm, measured, carrying the weight of observation rather than assumption. The agent nodded, understanding the implication, because patterns did not just reveal actions, they revealed decisions, and decisions revealed character. Inside the SUV, Ryan sat back again, his eyes moving toward the window, where the flashing lights reflected faintly across the glass, no longer symbols of control, but reminders of a role that had already shifted. And as he watched the scene unfold from this new perspective, a realization settled into place, quiet but unshakable. The system he had relied on had not failed him. It had simply reached the point where it could no longer ignore what had been there all along. Outside, Naomi turned slightly, her gaze lifting toward the wide Texas sky, where the stars remained unchanged, distant and steady, unaffected by the events below, and for a brief moment, the silence returned, not empty, but complete, the kind of silence that follows truth, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it has already been seen. And as the vehicles remained positioned along the roadside, their presence calm and deliberate, one thing became clear without a single word needing to be spoken. This was never just a stop on a highway. It was the moment the road finally answered back. The night did not rush forward. It did not erupt into noise or chaos. Instead, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if every second had already been measured long before this moment arrived. Inside the SUV, the tablet screen dimmed slightly before lighting again with a new set of files. Internal reports layered over time, each one connected by location, by method, by outcome. And Ryan watched as the narrative he once controlled was now being told without him. Told through data, through consistency, through truth that did not require explanation. There is always a moment, the agent said quietly, his voice steady and almost reflective, when a pattern stops being invisible. He tapped the screen lightly, bringing up a timeline that stretched across months. And once that moment comes, everything before it starts to make sense. And Ryan did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing left to counter, nothing left to reshape, only the quiet realization that what he had considered isolated choices had been forming something far larger than he had ever acknowledged. Outside, Naomi walked slowly toward the front of her vehicle, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, and the agent who stood beside her kept pace, not guiding, not directing, simply present. "You stayed calm the entire time," he noted, his tone carrying a quiet observation rather than praise. And Naomi glanced briefly toward the dark stretch of road before answering. "Calm is not about the moment," she said, her voice even. "It is about knowing what the moment leads to." And the simplicity of her words carried the weight of preparation, of time spent understanding not just actions, but outcomes. The agent nodded slightly, understanding that what had happened here was not spontaneous, not reactive, but structured, intentional, built piece by piece until it reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. Behind them, the patrol car lights continued to flash. But now they felt distant, almost symbolic, like a signal that no longer held authority, only memory. Inside the SUV, Ryan shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze moving once more to the window, where the reflection of those lights flickered faintly across the glass. And for a brief moment, he saw himself in that reflection, not as the officer standing on the roadside, not as the one issuing commands, but as someone observing from the outside, and that perspective carried a weight he could not ignore. "You are not the first," the agent across from him continued, his tone unchanged, "and you will not be the last." He paused briefly, letting the statement settle, not as a threat, but as a truth. Systems do not fail all at once. They reveal themselves piece by piece. And Ryan's hands remained still, his posture steady, but his thoughts moved differently now, no longer searching for control, but processing the absence of it. Outside, Naomi stopped near the front of her car, her gaze lifting toward the horizon where the road disappeared into darkness. And for a moment, everything felt still again, the wind soft, the distant sound of passing vehicles muted, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. The agent beside her spoke again, his voice lower now, almost conversational. "Do you ever think about the ones before this?" he asked, and Naomi did not answer immediately, her eyes remaining on the road, her expression thoughtful but composed. "Yes," she said finally. "That is why this matters." Her words quiet, but grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Inside the SUV, the tablet screen went dark, the data already saved, already secured, already part of something that extended beyond this night. And the agent leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on Ryan. "This is where accountability begins," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that did not need emphasis. Ryan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement, because there was no longer a version of this moment that belonged to him, no narrative he could adjust, no outcome he could influence. Only the steady unfolding of something that had been set into motion long before he ever saw Naomi's car on the road. Outside, the vehicles remained in place, their presence calm, deliberate, and as Naomi turned back toward her car, her movements unhurried, her posture steady. One thing became clear in the quiet stillness that followed. This was not the end of something sudden. It was the completion of something long overdue, and on that stretch of Texas highway, under lights that no longer defined power but revealed it, the truth had finally taken its place without needing to raise its voice. The road did not remember names. It did not remember faces. It only remembered what had passed across it, mile after mile, year after year, and on this night, under the fading pulse of red and blue lights, something that had moved unnoticed for far too long had finally been seen for what it was. Naomi opened her car door slowly and stepped inside, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about the moment required urgency, as if everything that needed to happen had already begun, and as she settled into the driver's seat, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, she paused for a brief second, looking ahead at the empty stretch of highway that now felt different, not because it had changed, but because the truth about it had finally surfaced. Behind her, the agents continued their quiet work, voices low, movements precise, documenting, confirming, ensuring that nothing about this night would be lost or overlooked. Because moments like this were not defined by how loud they were, but by how thoroughly they were understood. Inside the SUV, Ryan sat still, his posture no longer rigid, no longer shaped by the need to control, but by the weight of recognition. And as he looked out through the window, the reflection staring back at him was no longer framed by authority. It was framed by consequence, by the understanding that what had once felt routine had never truly been invisible. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to see it clearly. The agent beside him closed the tablet with a soft, deliberate motion, the data secured, the pattern established, the story no longer dependent on interpretation, and he spoke one final time, his voice steady, grounded. "This is how it works," he said, not as an explanation, but as a statement. Not quickly, not loudly, but completely. And Ryan listened, not because he had to, but because there was nothing left to resist, nothing left to question, only the quiet unfolding of a process that had already reached its conclusion. Outside, Naomi started the engine, the low hum blending into the night air as the headlights cast a clean, steady beam down the road ahead, illuminating a path that stretched far beyond the reach of the flashing lights behind her. And for a moment, she remained still, her eyes forward, her expression composed, not reflecting on what had just happened, but grounded in what it meant. The agent who had spoken with her earlier stepped back slightly, giving her space. His presence no longer needed in the same way, and as their eyes met briefly, there was no need for words, no need for acknowledgement beyond what had already been understood, because some moments did not require explanation. They only required recognition. Naomi shifted the car into drive, her foot easing onto the accelerator as the vehicle moved forward, leaving the scene behind not with urgency, not with relief, but with purpose. The road ahead open, steady, unchanged, yet no longer carrying the same weight it once had. Behind her, the lights continued to flash for a few seconds longer, marking the final moments of something that had already ended, before one by one they dimmed, their glow fading into the dark Texas night until all that remained was the quiet stretch of highway and the distant hum of passing traffic. Inside the SUV, Ryan closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to process, to understand, and when he opened them again, the view outside was no longer something he recognized as his domain. It was simply a road, like any other, a place where actions carried consequences whether seen immediately or not. The agent across from him remained composed, his presence steady, not imposing, not reactive, simply there, part of a system that did not need to announce itself to function. And as the vehicle door opened once more, signaling the next step in a process that would continue long after this night ended, one truth settled quietly into the space between them, not spoken, not emphasized, but undeniable. The road had never belonged to one man. It had never answered to power alone. It had always belonged to something greater, something patient, something that did not rush or force its way into the light, but waited until the right moment to be seen. And as Naomi's car disappeared into the distance, her taillights growing smaller until they became nothing more than a faint glow against the horizon, the Silence that followed carried a final clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained, because it is already understood. He thought he controlled the road, but in the end, the road remembered everything, and when it finally answered, it did not raise its voice. It simply revealed the truth.